Daydreamaholic by C. Don McCallum. Chapter 13. With her notebook and monologue in hand, Marcie walked into theater arts. The students were more buzzing than usual. Tension was thick in the air. People paced the room, furiously reading over their monologues. Everyone looked pale and a little scared. Everyone, that is, except Mrs. Lopez, who walked around the room listening to snippets of her students' work as she swirled around in her long, flowing skirt. "Sounds good, so and so," she'd say, and float on to the next student to do a little professional eavesdropping. It was safe to say that no one wanted to give their monologue except for a couple of class clowns who actually liked this sort of thing, and Marcie wasn't about to include herself in that category. "Okay, just walk in and smile at anyone who makes eye contact," she told herself. "If anyone asks about my shoes, I'll just smile and say it's part of my monologue." Marcie took a deep breath to try to relieve some of her anxiety and walked to her seat. Matt Ornelas was already sitting at his desk near her. "Smile," she told herself. It worked too. The corners of her mouth turned up and everything. Right on cue. Now if I can do my monologue that well. Matt was the first to speak. "So are you nervous?" Matt asked, looking a little flustered himself. "No," Marcie said, flashing a huge fake smile. "Not a bit. Are you?" They both laughed. That felt better. Now if she can just pull this thing off. As she sat, she noticed Matt wipe his hands on his pants. Boy, he really is nervous, she thought. She didn't ever remember him looking this freaked out before. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mrs. Lopez said, grinning, her long hair framing her angelic face, "the bell will be ringing shortly, so you'll want to find your seats and your nerve. We'll be starting soon." The feverish students went to their seats and looked over their monologues one last time. Even Tabitha looked a little worried. "Which means she'll probably be looking for someone to cut down to make herself feel better," Marcie warned herself. "I'm going to have to watch my step." She almost laughed, remembering her mismatched shoes. "I guess it's a little late for that." Just then, the familiar chime rang through the school. It was time to begin the much-dreaded monologues. Marcie smiled at Matt again and tucked her mismatched feet under her desk. The students who hadn't presented their monologues could barely concentrate on the speaker at the front of the room. Their minds were full of their own words, the ones they would have to utter in front of all of their classmates over the course of a whole 3 to 5 minutes. The makers of antiperspirant live for moments like these. Marcie's ears were completely focused, though. Her eyes were full of the person at the front of the room. His words consumed her. As Brandon explained to the class the finer points of scoring a touchdown, Marcie couldn't concentrate on anything else. He was simply fascinating. She never realized how complicated football was. But wait a minute. Marcie wondered, is that a zit on Brandon's forehead? She looked a little closer. It looked like he was just getting over a lot of little battles against acne, and a whole new platoon of soldiers were coming back for more. Marcie laughed to herself. I guess everyone has something that embarrasses them. At the end of his speech, Mrs. Lopez stopped the timer she held in her hand. "Very nice, Brandon. It's good to know you have brains to go along with that brawn." Mrs. Lopez's students were too worried to laugh. Brandon blushed, smiled, and made a beeline for his seat. As he swished by her, Marcie heard a girl's voice speaking. "Nice shoes," someone whispered. Marcie looked around. Mrs. Lopez was going over her list of students trying to find the next victim. Tabitha had taken the opportunity to criticize her. "Thank you," Marcie whispered, giving her a big smile. She was not going to let Tabitha get the best of her. Not now. "Let's see," Mrs. Lopez said, drawing it out as much as she could. She scanned the room, looking at each student, then the list of names before her. She gently brushed her hair away from her face. "Who should we hear from?" The students squirmed in their seats, waiting for her to make her decision. They wished it could be over with, or that Mrs. Lopez would finally come to her senses and realize how cruel she had been to give them this assignment in the first place. Marcie, yes, let's hear what you have to say next. As she made her way up to the front of the class, the students who hadn't gone yet breathed a sigh of relief. They wouldn't be next this time, and they didn't have on mismatched shoes in front of the entire class. A wave of giggles rolled through the class. Marcie shuffled her feet, making sure everyone saw her shoes. She mussed her hair, cleared her throat, and nodded to Mrs. Lopez. Marcie's 3 to 5 minutes had begun. I guess I'm pretty much like most girls across the country, maybe even around the world, Marcie told her classmates with confidence. She didn't know where that was coming from, but she wasn't going to question it at this point. I like eating pizza, watching sitcoms, listening to the radio a little too loudly, I might add. I love talking on the phone with my friends. I like to swim and to check out the latest fashions at the mall. My little brother, he drives me nuts. But my favorite thing, the thing that I like more than anything else in the whole wide world, Marcie paused and looked around the room for emphasis. You guessed it, I like boys. She held up her hands to bring attention to each word. But like most girls, the boys I like don't always like me back. Marcie dropped her hands to her side, just as she heard a few snickers in the room. Tabitha smirked in the back of the room, feeling triumphant. Fortunately, Matt's smiling face was there to give her a lift and help her carry on. I mean, I'm always trying to be whatever I think they want me to be. Isn't that what you're supposed to do? Her face took on an innocent expression. If I like a boy, I laugh at his jokes. I compliment him on his feats of strength, his accomplishments, and good looks, always in the coolest, most casual way I know how. I try to look my best for him, dressing up every day, never forgetting to wear a smile and have a kind word toward him and all his friends. If he needs help with his homework, I'm there. If he ever needed a shoulder to lean on, Marcie pointed to her shoulder. Isn't this one inviting? Matt grinned. She felt more energized. It's fun liking boys. If it weren't, why would so many girls go to all this trouble? Because believe me, there are some side effects of having a crush. Let's take forgetfulness, for example. Marcie raised her finger in the air to make a very important point. Looking confused, she said, well, I did have an example, but I can't quite remember it right now. There's loss of appetite. Like I totally forgot to eat lunch today, as some of you will find out if you have a class with me later this afternoon. The stomach you'll hear growling will be mine, and all because I like boys. Another side effect? Poor fashion sense, Marcie enunciated, looking down at her shoes and frowning. I get so lost in daydreams like the one where the guy I like and I finally get married and are on our way to Paris. The world around me just disappears. Can you believe I thought I was looking pretty good when I left the house this morning? Marcie strutted just a little for effect. But when the Eiffel Tower faded behind the flagpole, my old friend Reality was sitting on the front steps of the school waiting for me. Marcie sighed and frowned. And you know what? More often than not, just like girls all over the country, all over the world, the reality is that the boy I like doesn't always like me back. But you know what? Marcie asked with a sly grin on her face. I'm not going to let that stop me because not only do I like boys, she smiled with confidence, I like myself. At first, there was just a smattering of applause. Probably just Matt, Marcie thought. But when students started standing up one at a time, applauding louder and louder, Marcie knew that she was a success. Who would have ever imagined, Marcie thought, taking a deep bow to each row of students, that I'd get a standing ovation just for being myself. Thank you for listening to Daydreamaholic by C. Don McCallum. If you're enjoying this story, please consider sharing it with someone you know. And please like the video and subscribe to this channel to help others discover these stories.